We have our next panel discussion, which is we hold some truths to be self-evident for the common good. Our fourth and final theme for discussion today is for the common good, a reminder about the importance of civics and democracy and the central role of democracy in the work that we're doing for this commemoration. I'm excited to give the stage to Merle McGee, commission member and executive director and CEO of Everyday Democracy, and Ramin Ganeshram, Connecticut Humanities Board member and executive director of the Westport Museum for History and Culture.
Like
tall chairs for
tall
short people.
chairs for short people. How's everybody doing? Okay, great. So, I have a little thing here. As stated, my name is Merle McGee, and I am in the role as steward of an organization called Everyday Democracy. We're a dialogic organization that utilizes dialogue as a way to ignite and excite people about civic engagement and this little thing we call democracy. We're gonna get into. Before I begin anything, I always like to offer a land, labor, and life acknowledgement. So I'll read that very quickly. We acknowledge the land we inhabit are the ancestral homelands of First Nation people. We pay respect to all Indigenous people, past and present and future, for their continued presence on the homeland and for their diaspora. We pay homage to those stolen from Africa, placed in bondage, and called slaves, who never submitted and were always fully human. We pay respect to their unbroken connection to the divine and to each other, and for their still unpaid labor. And to both our Indigenous and African forebearers, we commit to struggle for liberation and reparation. Just so you know how we're going to get off here. We're going to get this going. So, I have the pleasure and the honor to be in conversation with Ramin Ganeshram, who is and serves as the executive director of the Westport Museum for History and Culture. It is here that she reimagined and reinterpreted the local history to be more inclusive and reflective of all the area's residents, past and present. Under her leadership, the museum has partnered closely with organizations focused on BIPOC, that's Black, Indigenous, and people of color, because alphabet soups are annoying. Cultural movements. And with her at the helm, the museum has been recognized by museum industry leaders and by Connecticut Humanities as a standard bearer for how small and mid-range museums can truthfully and faithfully address American history around race and identity, particularly relating to slavery and civil rights. In addition, if that wasn't enough, Ramin is an award-winning journalist, author, chef, and culinary historian whose work appeared in publications. She's written a few books, cookbooks, and novels, and her work appears in the Netflix series High on the Hog. So please welcome Ramin. All right, so enough of me talking. We wanted to start out by asking the audience a couple of questions. I hear there are some historians here. Okay, a couple maybe. So Raise your hand if you know who John Mason is. Okay. Can anyone, and we may need a mic here, Cindy. Can anyone tell us something about John Mason really quickly? Not a dissertation, not a book, not a quiz. One thing about John Mason. Who wants to tell us one thing about John Mason? I saw a lot of hands go up, so you can just go to anybody because everybody raised their hand.
He was a militia,
He was a what?
militia captain.
A militia captain. Thank you. Any other thing about John Mason? Okay. There's a school named after him. Anything else about John Mason?
I am not a historian, but it's my understanding that he was also an integral part of the massacre.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear what you said.
He was an integral part of the Pequot massacre in Mystic.
Oh,
She's not a historian.
okay. So that's good to know, that there is both some history about John Mason that one might call positive and some that might call less than positive, right? Okay, next person. Who knows who Harriet Beecher Stowe? This is an easy one. Raise your hand if you know. Okay, so who wants to tell us one thing about Harriet Beecher Stowe?
She was an abolitionist author. She wrote Not Uncle Tom's Cabin.
Great. Down front, we have another person. Thank you.
She spent many of her summers growing up in Guilford, Connecticut.
One other person?
Her home in Hartford is a museum.
Great, thank you. I mean, if I asked you who was Harriet Stowe, what might you say?
Well, I would say that she was an unwitting promoter of racial stereotypes.
Last person, Eli Whitney. Yes. Ooh, man.
Okay, I'm from Hamden, so that's why I know this. He was the inventor of the cotton gin.
Thank you. Okay, we have another hand over here. I love this. Oh, now we're cooking. People, y'all are picking it up. Raise your hand and say something.
He got a contract to manufacture rifles for the US Army in a factory in Hamden that contributed to the development of mass production interchangeable parts.
What would you say about Eli Whitney?
So I would say those things are true. I would say that he was also a prolonger of enslavement in the United States because of said cotton gin.
So, one of the reasons why Ramin and I wanted to ask you all about Connecticut heroes is because a lot of times in history, we sort of carry a sinner saint approach to capturing in our histories. And the invitation for this conversation is how do we tell the totality of the stories of the people who we decide are important enough to write down and remember, if in fact history is a subjective activity. I propose that it is. So we want to ground our conversation today really in this quote from James Baldwin. On the contrary, the great force of history comes from the fact that we carry it within us. are unconsciously controlled by it in many ways, and history is literally present in all that we do. It could scarcely be otherwise, since it is to history that we owe our frames of reference, our identities, and our aspirations. So with that, let's get into the conversation about some of these truths that some people thought was self-evident. And so the first question that I have for you to explore is, what are the foundational beliefs that shape our founders' actions?
So I'm pausing because Merle and I actually talk about this a lot, right? And what I'm going to answer this by saying is, I'm going to answer by saying the foundational beliefs that we are all taught and have been taught and continually talk about being the beliefs that influenced, right, the nation. So I'm going to say the things we all know: life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, freedom to, and under that umbrella, freedom to pursue commerce, to participate in a democratic process. Right? So this is what we're told are the foundational beliefs. Of course, it's always more nuanced than that.
I would love to hear if you have any additional thoughts about
I
that
always
question.
do. Yeah, so I think, my thought about this is that when we have discussions like this, right, we're coming at it from this place of, these are the foundational beliefs, and yet we know these foundational beliefs have not historically applied to everybody. And then what we discuss is this dissonance between what is said and what has happened, right? And I think that we struggle in part because what we should really be looking at is what was said and what was meant, right? And I can go on unless you.
Please do.
Okay, so, the thing is, what was said, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, participation in the democratic process, was a very genuine belief system for the people to whom it applied, right? And so what I often say is, when we discuss this about exclusion, right, the best we can say is that they actively excluded the rest of us, right? People of color, women, and so on. The thing is, they didn't, because they weren't thinking about us. When they were creating a system of government, a republic, they were applying rules based on who were citizens in the world in which they lived, right? And I want to be clear, I'm not saying we need to judge them by virtue of their time and therefore their behavior is excusable. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that, to me, we need to first understand the impetus and the motivation so that we understand where the exclusions happened, and then we can reframe the question. I know that's sort of a tortured sense of kind of thinking about it. But I'm going to give you an example that I know that many of you are very familiar with. So many people in this room, of course, know that Connecticut did not have a state constitution until 1818, meaning we ran our state, even after the American Revolution, using our royal charter, right? The charter given by King Charles II, right, in the 1630s. So, shockingly, a long time to after a revolution still be operating by a royal charter. That charter did not have a race exclusion for voting. Didn't. So by 1814, when there were Black men who had benefited from gradual abolition and could meet the state requirements for voting, registered to vote, there was a big outcry. There was a big problem. There was a lot of protest, right? There was no race exclusion in the royal charter that we were working with. 1814, a race exclusion was voted in. And by 1818, when we had our state constitution, it was absolutely inculcated, right? And you might say to yourself, students say this to me all the time, but why wasn't there a race exclusion? Because it wasn't even conceivable that indigenous or Black men, never women, would be voting. That just wasn't the world construct. So when we talk about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness and exclusions, they weren't exclusions. They simply weren't on the table. And I think that's where we have to start.
And I really appreciate your point there, because I think that when you start with what actually is, it offers you the window to be able to address from that position. And so there is a moral outcry around the exclusion that people experience based on an idea that folks sitting in the room today would believe would be necessary. But if you have constructed a society, and I think that it's important, we've danced around it a lot today, the fact that we constructed a society to benefit European descendant first men, and then those who have been able to eke out a little bit of engagement with that society, that becomes the rational place that you begin to understand why is our inability to name and face our history so difficult. It's difficult because we are presuming an engagement and a belief in the common good, right? That actually wasn't there. And so we're just keeping it real in the conversation now so that we can actually dig in a little bit more about, well, what's available to us if we start from a place of truth. Truth. How about that? Okay, so let's keep going. Let's imagine, though, that there are some incongruence between the belief systems and these ideas, or the realities, I should say, of settler colonialism. How do we reconcile with those incongruences as we try to invite people into a more honest conversation about who we are and how we got started in this business, this experiment, right, of America?
So, in my opinion, I think, the real issue is we need to get to a place where, as you said, facts are facts, right? These are facts, right? It wasn't an exclusion. It was, just a non-consideration. And the reason I advocate for looking at it that way is I think where people get caught up in is feeling some kind of way, feeling some kind of guilt, feeling some kind of nervousness, some kind of anxiousness about what their ancestors, what the forebears, what the founders of the nation did. And I think that actually it's not a very academic response. That's what we need to get away from first, right? And I think that as historians, as museum professionals, even as academics, we actually have to set a ground rules for when someone tells you X, it is not meant to make you feel like Y, right? Because I think what we need to do is strip that emotional layer out as much as we can, so then we can revert to facts, right? You may be a direct line descendant of John Mason, agent of genocide. That doesn't mean that you necessarily agreed with him or you inculcate those values, right? Let us all agree that that's where we're coming from right now, right? So that we can talk about him in that way, right? You may be a direct line descendant of Thomas Jefferson, right? Who, I don't even have to get into Jefferson. We all know about him, right? And when he wrote those words, clearly did not mean it for the people he enslaved, right? You may be his descendant, but we're not assuming you agree with that behavior, unless, of course, you tell us that you do, right? So let's start from there, almost like an emotional level setting. And I think that as historians, academics, museum professionals, I'm a journalist by training. I worked for the New York Times for 10 years, right? So I'm trained very much to be like, no emotion, fact, well, we used to be, I'm not gonna talk about now. fact, point, counterpoint, point, counterpoint. I think the truth of our society is we don't live in that place. We don't exist in that place. Let's admit that and find ways to then level set on that emotional level so that we can have these conversations.
Yes. And what I heard earlier today was the tension around the stumbling blocks of the emotional connection to the story we want to tell ourselves of who we are versus the facts of who we were and who we continue to be. And that the stumbling block is in fact our own desire to make it something different, whether that's a reinterpretation of what we think we understood were in the hearts of men and that time, as opposed to just honoring that. I think in our earlier conversation when we were prepping for this call, that you described America not as sort of this ideal democratic society, but as a corporation, and that we are founded as a corporation, and that has a particular focus and meaning that feels important to be honest about. And I keep saying truth and honesty because I believe the truth will set you free if you reckon with that truth. So if you could expand a little bit more about this idea of America as a corporation and the context in which we're now trying to reckon with the history of who we are and why we experience, right, the kinds of inconsistencies, and I'm being polite, inconsistencies with our espoused values as a nation and the realities that we just heard a little bit about in the panel before. So, if you might.
So again, at the risk of saying things that many of you know, when I say that America is a corporation, it was made as a corporation, from the earliest moments of colonization, it was companies, right? The Dutch West India Company, the London Company, the Virginia Company that held shares in the development of the Caribbean and North America. And the people who came here in service of as direct employees or adjacent to the direct employees of the corporation came here to create a profit base for those corporations, right? So it's my belief that all of the principles of our country are based in this idea of reaping profit by any means necessary from the natural resources of this land, and then the unfree human resources that came first from genociding indigenous people and then enslaving people of African descent. So to me, if you frame life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness around the idea of a corporation needing to make money, it takes on a different tenure, right? You have the liberty to pursue your profit margin by any means necessary, right? You have the right to be happy in the wealth that you've accumulated by any means necessary. I mean, even down to, centuries later, the thing that is still said about our nation is that it's an opportunity based, right? And my parents were immigrants. You come here to do better financially. And I think, and I would put that line in the sand, right? Yes, there's an idea of freedom, and certainly, my mother was from Iran, right? So there's certainly this idea of freedom, and in many ways, and the saving of one's life to come to a place like America. But the first thing is almost always you can do financially better than you can elsewhere. And I would argue with you that I would posit to you all that's because America is a corporate store. America is a company store, right? And that is what we sell. So all of these lofty ideals to me is foundational, especially since, let's be honest, the men who put together these ideals were the wealthiest in American society. Jefferson was a Virginia planter, so was Washington. They benefited the most from their ancestors coming over here in service of the company.
And so when we think about this idea of America as a corporation or a company store, which I just love that. Not the idea, just the framing of it. It begins to make sense around the myth making that occurs and that we have built to entice others here, but also to entice the aspirations and dreams of folks who have not had access from the very beginning to that company store. And in a very particular way, makes us all complicit in that myth making. Y'all feel okay? Everybody okay? Y'all take a deep breath. Right? It's you know, it's not really the story we want to sit down and tell our children, right?
But
I mean, you know, it's like, because I mean, I know that we have to commemorate, celebrate, remember the founding of our nation, right? 250 years. I think Valerie Tudson said she was 10 when the last time this thing went around, and I was 8. I was 8, you know? And there's all this story and myth making that we do as a nation that continues to create this disconnection, but also this discontent. And those who benefit from it most feel that tension. That's why you're uncomfortable, because you know it's a lie, right? That we're all complicit in myth making around, but we have to carry the story in some way so that, you know, we're number one, we're exceptional. We're exceptional. That's the myth of who we say we are, exceptional.
You know, but I want to say, I think that, you know, the reason that we advocate for this level setting of the truth is because we can have honest conversations about where we should go and what this idealized nation as we want it to be could be if we don't start from a place of honesty, right? If everybody isn't at the table with the same understanding. I mean, you talked about the bicentennial, you were 8 years old, so was I. My father was from Trinidad, and he was very much involved in his American children feeling close to their nation. So that year we went to Philadelphia, we went to Mount Vernon, where I had a traumatic experience, and it's pretty funny because I'm a fellow at Mount Vernon now, but that's another story. You know, the Statue of Liberty. And I'll tell you the thing, even as much as my father said to us, my brother and I, this is your country. You're from a long line, you're the logical conclusion of a long line of nation builders. This democracy is for you. I would look at my father and I would look at all the people scurrying around in their, you know, colonial outfits and think, nah, that's not us. It's not me. There's no representation here, right? And that lack of so it makes it very hard for people who are outside of the mold to feel that you're really being included in the conversation. And that's, I think, the point of level setting the truth, right? Because we were all in the conversation, some of us in less than ideal ways.
Right, exactly. So then that really then takes me to the next question. So how does a failure to reckon with our history create the stumbling blocks to an inclusive future?
Well, I mean, part of it is, you know, what I said, where that if you can't come to the table honestly, you can't have productive conversations. And this is what we tell our children. This is what we say in business. We say this in every other aspect of our lives. We got to be honest with each other if we want to get anywhere. Why are we accepting, you know, dissembling on the part of our sort of national identity? Why? When in our social and our emotional lives, we have recognized then you have to start from a place of honesty. But here's why I think we need to be honest. It's not honesty for its own sake. It's not an academic exercise, right? Yeah, I mean, I am all about truth and facts, and I'm always going to say the fact, no matter what, but not for its own sake. It's because those facts explain things like systemic racism. They explain things like, othering and disassociating whole groups of people from society. It explains the foundational reason for immigration laws, for why affirmative action was overruled, and so on and so on and so on. Often people will say to me, my staff often says this to me, because we're not the same in many ways. Meaning, well, Ramin, everything isn't about race. And my answer always is, this is the United States of America. Everything is about race. It was built on genocide of indigenous people, clear, right? And then further created on the unfree labor of enslaved Africans. It is about race. America was built on race, right? We need to understand that so that we understand the systems, including the systems of law. I mean, I just talked about the 1818 Constitution of Connecticut were created. That's why, right? It's not just about, trashing Thomas Jefferson, although I should stop talking about Jefferson. If you haven't guessed, I don't like Jefferson very much, but I'm not trying to trash him, but.
And I think that your point is well taken, in particular, as I recently had the privilege of unpacking and uncovering ancestry work that my mother did, that allows me to name 7 generations of African descendant people. I'm the 7th generation of African descendant people in the United States. And there is a clarity about the conditions under which folks journeyed for me to be sitting here having this very honest conversation with you today. And I know that sometimes, not sometimes, a lot of times, folk who are who were enslaved elsewhere don't want to really talk about that story, that through line that creates the narrative of what you've stepped into and why the things are the way they are. They're not by happenstance, and they are absolutely constructed. And I think that your invitation for us to think about the initial architecture of the nation through this commerce lens really helps us understand more why it is absolutely necessary to lean into the history of settler colonialism and what that required, genocide, and the great wealth of a nation and what that required, which was forced, unpaid labor under incredibly brutal conditions. And I'm always struck, particularly by folks who were a part of the global trade of stealing people and labor, get confused when they get here about what it is and this myth making that we do.
Right. And I think, along those lines, you talked about American exceptionalism. And so one of the things that I advocate for, let's reframe what exceptionalism really is. Outside of the museum, a good percentage of all of my work actually is focused on an individual enslaved by George Washington. And so I spend a lot of time working with the descendant community at Mount Vernon and other descendant groups. And the thing that I try to make clear about this topic in terms of let's restructure the idea of exceptionalism, which it's interesting when we talk about, recent immigrant families, we also talk about this opportunity toward exceptionalism, right? I strove, I lifted myself above my status, but here's what I want us to reframe. To me, when we talk about the 250th, when we talk about all of those who now make up this imperfect union, exceptionalism is the fact that there remains, albeit in greatly reduced numbers, Indigenous communities in the face of what was done that is exceptional. The fact that you have 7 generations of descendants of, one enslaved person, exceptional, that people survived under these conditions. I think that's where we have to start from. I think that we need to take back these ideas of the founding and what makes us American, reframe them based on reality, and then talk about how do we uplift these ideals with respect to the 250th.
I love that. So let's talk about the 250th. America, she got a birthday coming up. Right? And so I hear again that there are historians and educators in the room, and probably some parents too. What are some actions that historians and educators can take to advance understanding about who we are and productive engagement with those contradictions? And I'm just going to say, I say productive because shame and guilt are unproductive emotions. They offer no fuel, no energy, no air, no creativity, no purpose, no sense of belonging, no well-being. So if we could engage productively around these conversations, what might you offer this room to consider? You do run a whole museum. I've been there. It's fabulous. It's great. You should go.
Thank you for that plug. So, I mean, the first thing I would say is referencing what you talked about, shame and guilt. I would say that we all need to put aside our impulse to first frame it within our individual emotional framework, right? People often are very well-meaning, and they'll say, I know what my ancestors did. I own that. I'm so ashamed. You don't need to be ashamed. Let's put that aside. Stop. Let's not talk about that, right? Let's talk about it from, these factual perspectives. I'd say to educators, there are many, many museums and historical societies and organizations that work in public history that have resources for you, right? What we say to Westport Public Schools is when you are talking about enslavement, we will give you copies of deeds of sale of human beings by Westporters, European Westporters, amongst each other, selling people of African descent, right? We're going to make it real for you and create a sense of place. So for the educators in the audience, tap these small organizations, mid-sized organizations, the Connecticut Museum for History and Culture, all of them, and say, what can you show me to make this real and factual? So it's not a theoretical argument anymore. I think that goes a long way. I would say that to my fellow historians who are not public historians, but are in the classroom, engage public historians, engage those same organizations, because history, in my opinion, cannot only be theoretical, right? Every minute that has passed us is now history. It's not theoretical, right? It affects daily life. So to me, I think that's two of the most important things. And then the last thing I would say is, and this is tricky, I understand this, try to think of creative ways to have discussions about history. We call it stealth history in my institution. We're always trying to find ways to trick people into coming and engaging in history. So for example, one of the things we do is we have an escape room in our barn, which is a historic structure. And for 2026, it's going to be Washington's spies, right? But what we're gonna do is use an area of question within that story of the culper spiring. I'm sure many of you know it. For an unknown person, a woman who is to this day unknown. And since she's unknown, we can posit that she's somebody who you don't think she might be, right? An enslaved woman, a woman of indigenous descent, and so on. We don't know yet. We're doing it, right? But the point is, are there ways that you can use different methodologies based in good history and primary source material to engage people? And you said I'm a culinary historian. I am, and I use foodways for this a lot. This kind of tricks people. They're like, "Ooh, I want to eat a chocolate cream pie from 18th century America." I'm like, I bet you do. Let's talk about how we got the cocoa. So.
I love that. And before we go to questions, I feel I would be remiss not to ask you about your beloved Hercules Posey and share a little bit about the story, his story, which is our story. It's a hidden story until someone here found it, went looking for it, actually, I should say, in the spirit of the other conversation earlier, hidden in plain sight, went looking for this story. And how might the story and that journey that you took around Hercules Posey be an invitation to all of us to grapple with the both and the totality of, and the dynamism, right, of humanity in the context of the crucible of the founding of this nation. That's that's how I see it. It's a crucible. So.
All right, I'm going to try to be brief because the people in the audience who know me and know this topic, Jason's laughing, knows that I could talk about it like literally for the next 6 hours, and he would be like, please stop. So the short of it is that Hercules Posey was the chef enslaved by George Washington, one of many chefs enslaved by George Washington, but he's noted because he was with Washington in Philadelphia for the bulk of his presidency, meaning that 1 year the presidency was in New York, if you remember the history, and then for the remaining 8, it was in Philadelphia, and Hercules was there with him. Washington acquired Hercules as a forfeit mortgage. A neighbor owed him money and mortgaged Hercules and 25 other human beings in the event that he could not pay him back, and he couldn't, and so he acquired Hercules. So this was a known-ish story, and I'm not going to get into all the details about how I became obsessed, and that's really the only word, about this man for the last 15 years. But I started digging and wrote a novel about him. I'm in the process of writing a narrative biography because I have found actually more information. He had self-emancipated on Washington's birthday in 1797 and was seen once more in New York in 1801 and then not again. And then a colleague and I found him in 2019 buried in New York City. He had lived out his life in New York City. The work I do around Hercules is really for the purpose of building a different view to the founding of the American Republic. Because every meal that he made was a diplomatic meal setting the stage for what would be diplomatic dining in America. This idea of food easing the conversation of nation building and diplomacy and international relations, right? The procurement of the food from Black farmers and oystermen and cake sellers and confectioners and so on, hucksters, is a conversation of the people who are not seen when we talk about things like the founding of the nation, the celebration of the revolution. During the revolution, Washington had 2 enslaved cooks working for him throughout the entire campaign, whom he rented from a New York minister. Like Connecticut, most of the prolific enslavers in the state of New York were ministers, judges, lawyers, and so on, right? They eventually were able to buy their freedom through their labor during the Revolution for Washington, and were later recognized by General Lafayette. Big anniversary for him this year of his American tour. So this work for me is not only because I am a chef, I relate to him on a lot of other reasons as well, but because under this surface of Jefferson and Washington and Adams and Hamilton and Knox and all of the rest of them, and Madison was this unwilling supporting cast of enslaved people who were actually doing the labor necessary to build the nation. And so that's one of the main reasons why my focus on him, I think, is so important to me and talking about this story of America.
Thank you for that. Appreciate it. The hidden stories, the engines that make America go. We talk about it, right, from the immigrant experience, but that has always been the story of America, the company store. So any questions for the great Ramin? Are y'all just stunned in silence? Amaris has a question and we have a paper question. So we can start with Amaris and grab your paper question.
People who know me know I don't need the mic, but I'll use it anyway. Thank you so much. It's great to hear the two of you in conversation about these important topics. I was wondering, Ramin, I was struck by a really interesting potential tension between some of the things we talked about in this panel and the question about making history come alive through empathy and emotional connection. That really was a feature of the previous panel on doing history and storytelling. And I think was very much on display in the story you just told about Hercules Posey. As historians, we always develop these intimate relationships with the people that we research and study, and they become real to us in these ways. But you spent a bunch of time also talking about removing some of the emotion to kind of lower the temperature. So I'm wondering if you can dig into that potential tension for me a little bit more. How do we strike the right balance between creating that emotional connection, helping people fall in love with perhaps some new stories in history or some new characters, with that need to do that level setting that you talked about?
That's a really good question. I think, as you were talking, I was thinking about, how would I explain what I mean? And I think the simple way for me to say it is, not everything you feel needs to be said out loud, right? So have the empathy, have that emotional investment in getting it right. You have to work through feeling however you feel about the circumstances that we're faced with. You don't have to say it, right? And you definitely don't necessarily have to say it. I'm just going to say it to you, to people of color, right? To people who are descendant of these impacted communities, unless they let you know they're open to hearing that, right? I think that having the emotion and the empathy and the concern is going to be the engine for you to get it right. Ask yourself if saying it out loud is about getting recognition for getting where you should be, or is it really about doing the work, right? As I used to say to my daughter when she was a toddler, we don't have to articulate every single thing in our mind, right? So I think that, feel it, use it as an empathetic exercise to think about things critically and understand facts from the really bare and raw and often very difficult place that they reside. You don't necessarily have to make that part of the conversation. This is just my opinion. I mean, I'm sure there are people who disagree with me. But.
I mean, if I would just add on, perhaps it's the recognition that the feeling and the empathy is not the center of the exploration and the engagement with the material. It is a tool to support your engagement with it. But I think that sometimes what happens is that because we feel such a way, we can't even take in history or facts or truth as it bears out in front of us. And so we override our human empathy in the face of brutal facts. It's kind of what I might add to that conversation. Yes.
So I'm with one of the sponsors, the Connecticut Supreme Court Historical Society. So I was very pleased to hear you mention the charter, which is actually 1662.
Thank you.
Very important.
I know I forgot it. Thank you.
Very important point. So I'd like to expound a little bit on that. Could you expound on why the founders, in administering the Charter of 1662 and in writing the Declaration of Independence, had a narrower conception of the common good and freedom than we do today? And how do we get at why they had a narrower conception?
Well, I'm not them, so I can't exactly, I can only talk about, I think, what we know, what the world order was at the time, right? It was a world order that was based in a European-centric idea, right? I would make the argument that that also was hardened and made foundational by the international slave trade, right? Which necessitated ranking people by value, right? By their racial identity. You can't enslave people and treat them like beasts of burden if they're up here with you. They have to be down here with, beasts of burden. So, so for me, that worldview that, which is also sort of normal, right? You're the center of your world. And to me, it's based in that very fact, right? They were operating in a world that was centered on their benefit, right? I'm not well-versed enough to talk about, larger philosophical ideas in that period of time that would make them think that about themselves. That's not my area, right? But, as I said before, I don't think that they were really thinking about it in this way of like, we're the best and the rest of you can just, we're not, we're going to make sure to exclude you. I don't think they were thinking about anybody else. I think that they centered the world around themselves in the way they knew, in the way we all do, right? And just weren't thinking about themselves. I mean, that's not a very articulate answer to you, but I think that a real scholar of the period could really dig into all the sociocultural reasons why they thought that. But, I also have to think it has to do with this kind of ranking of human value as part of the Atlantic trade.
I am not a historian, but I do know a few things. And what I might add is that the worldview in this part of the world was shaped first and foremost by the doctrine of discovery, which gave permission to take anything that Europeans to take anything that they saw fit to based on this idea of the superiority and their closeness to their religious, worldview. And so I think that absolutely shaped how and why one could engage in such activities to begin to rank human beings in such a way and to create and craft a society based on that hierarchy. We all have in some way encountered Notes on Virginia. We all know Thomas Jefferson's obsession with ranking and categorizing things and drawing upon, other kinds of pseudoscience in order to justify these decisions. I think the point that we're trying to make here is just say the thing that was the thing that was the thing, because then we can actually move on and move forward in some truth of understanding why we believe, and some people believe in their superiority. And I say that very frankly, because if people were not so concerned about ensuring that the totality and the completeness of American history, or even just other people's stories other than the usual suspects were included, they would not be banning history. They would not be burning books. They understand the power of history and truth, and they don't want you to have it. And because it wasn't available, and now people are able to unpack and carry those stories, and more people are carrying those stories. Now we don't want history for anybody. And that's just, I mean, I'm just keeping it real.
I have a question. I think that your point is so interesting to me because why did they think that? I mean, the question is, to me, we know they did think it because their actions played out with that belief. I think what I would ask, and I don't have an answer, is why do we need to be concerned anymore with why they thought it? Because the result of what they thought is clear, right? The multi-century, engagement and the end result of what they thought is very obvious to us all. We're living it. We've been living it for centuries. How important is the why of it? Because I would make the argument that, again, why they thought that, current people of European descent in America thinking however they think about history, it's not actually the same why. I'm going to go out on a limb and make the argument that those of you in the audience of European descent are not following the doctrine of discovery, grabbing things and thinking it's yours. I'm going to just go out on a limb thinking that, that's not what you think, right? So it's almost like, and again, I'm not saying that I have an answer, but I wonder why it's important to know the why at this point, since we know what the end result was. And that's what we have to contend with.
Any more questions out there, Cindy?
I think this is our last one. I'm coming over.
Thank you, Jesus.
Hi again. I think this raises some real interesting and thought-provoking questions into what are our foundational beliefs right now in the present.
I'm confused about that every day. Like, I
was gonna say, I think we think we're better than we are.
oh, yeah.
I think that's a foundational belief.
Yeah. So actually, one of the things I do say, and I say this very much in context of where I work and live, which is Westport, Connecticut, a thing that people always say is, we're better than this. And I think, no, you're not. We're not, right? Like, this is not who we are. And I think, this is exactly who we are. This is America. What are you talking about? And I think that's what it is. I think the foundational belief that we have is that we're better than we are. And I think it goes back to how we started this conversation, right? This belief that life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, the democratic process in which we can all engage as a pure ideal is really where we started. And because we believe that, then all the things that in our front of our eyes that contradict that make us feel like we need to say, but that's not us, that's not us. And that's what I think, it is. I think foundationally, we want to believe that. Who doesn't want to believe that, right? But I think that we have to come back to what we started out saying is that we can believe it as long as it's mitigated by the time and the place and the who and the how. So we're not so horribly shocked into saying things like, this isn't who we are. It is who we are.
But there's a call to action. It doesn't mean it's who we have to be. And so the invitation to us all, as we grapple with the truth and the reality and reckon with that truth, is how do we build new understanding, new relationships, new ways of being in relationship to the ideals that maybe we now hold for ourselves to be self-evident. And with that, I thank you, Ramin, for an incredible conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And so with that, can you hear me? There we go. And so with that, we are off to our last coffee break of the day. Stretch your legs, and then we'll come back together for one final session on marketing your America 250 story.